There are moments when silence becomes too loud to ignore, when the familiar noise of your daily existence suddenly feels like an elaborate mask, and beneath it, something ancient stirs with the patience of stone. What if the emptiness you've learned to fear is actually a field of information waiting to be read? She sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of a life carefully constructed, and felt the weight of something unnamed pressing against her chest. It wasn't sadness, it was deeper than that. It was the recognition that beneath all her knowing, all her spiritual seeking, all her attempts to heal, there existed a vast library of whispers she had never learned to read. The silence held secrets her soul remembered, but her mind had forgotten how to access. This isn't about channeling messages from ascended masters or receiving mystical downloads. This is about recognizing that consciousness itself leaves impressions in an invisible field, and that field responds to the quality of your inner stillness. The Akashic Field isn't some distant cosmic library. It's the subtle dimension where every emotion you've ever felt, every trauma you've inherited, every moment of transcendence you've touched, exists as living information accessible through embodied presence. There was a woman who moved into an old Victorian house and found herself crying at unexpected moments. Not her tears. They felt borrowed, ancient. When she finally sat still enough to listen, she realized the house held emotional impressions from everyone who had ever grieved within its walls. She wasn't losing her mind. She was accessing a field of memory that existed beyond personal experience. Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious as a shared psychic substrate containing universal patterns and memories. The Akashic Field operates similarly, not as a mystical concept, but as the subtle dimension where consciousness leaves energetic impressions. Every emotion you felt, every trauma processed or suppressed, every moment of authentic connection creates ripples in this invisible field. What you experience as sudden intuitions or inexplicable emotional responses may be your nervous system detecting information from this field. Your body is constantly reading subtle, energetic data, the emotional residue of places, the unspoken tensions between people, the ancestral patterns encoded in your cellular memory. Research in quantum coherence suggests that consciousness may operate through non-local field effects. The polyvagal theory reveals how your nervous system processes information below the threshold of conscious awareness. When you walk into a room and immediately feel uncomfortable, or when you sense someone's emotional state without any obvious cues, you're accessing field information through your body's sophisticated detection systems. The Akashic Field isn't separate from this biological capacity. It's the expanded understanding that consciousness creates subtle impressions that can be perceived by those with sufficient embodied sensitivity. He had built a life of constant motion, work, exercise, social engagements, entertainment, but in the rare moments when everything stopped, a particular quality of discomfort would arise. Not anxiety exactly, but a deep unease, as if stillness itself were dangerous. It took years before he realized he wasn't afraid of silence. He was afraid of what the silence wanted to tell him about the parts of himself he had learned to keep moving to avoid. This is the paradox of modern spiritual seeking. We crave connection to something deeper, while simultaneously organizing our lives to avoid the very stillness that would allow such connection to emerge. The discomfort you feel in true silence isn't emptiness. It's the pressure of unexpressed emotional material seeking integration. When you allow yourself to be still without agenda, without trying to meditate your way into a peaceful state, something remarkable happens. The body begins to release layers of held experience. What Jung called shadow integration often begins not with psychological analysis, but with somatic awareness of what you've been carrying without knowing it. The Akashic Field responds to this quality of undefended presence. As you become willing to feel what you've been avoiding, the field begins to offer information, not through mystical visions, but through the gradual recognition of patterns, the emergence of body memories, the sudden clarity about why certain places or people trigger inexplicable responses. Every emotion you've ever pushed away doesn't disappear. It creates subtle contractions in your energy field. Shame curls inward like a protective shell. Rage creates rigid boundaries. Grief pools in the depths of your chest cavity. These aren't metaphors. They're somatic realities your body experiences as energetic formations. When you develop the capacity to feel these formations without immediately trying to fix or release them, you begin to access the information they contain. Why did this pattern form? What was it protecting? What does it need to finally transform? A concert pianist lost her ability to play after a car accident. The physical damage healed, but her hands had developed a mysterious tremor that appeared only when she approached the piano. Through somatic therapy, she discovered the tremor wasn't fear of performing. It was her hands holding the cellular memory of her grandmother, who had been forced to stop playing piano during the war. Her body was carrying ancestral grief that had never been acknowledged or released. Your body is a sophisticated antenna capable of detecting subtle, energetic information that your thinking mind cannot access. The tingling you feel when entering certain spaces, the sudden shift in your breathing around particular people, the inexplicable heaviness that settles in your chest during specific conversations. These aren't random phenomena. They're your nervous system's way of processing field information. What ancient traditions called subtle body awareness, modern science recognizes as interoception, your ability to sense internal bodily signals. But this capacity extends beyond monitoring hunger, thirst, or heart rate. Highly sensitive individuals often report sensing emotional atmospheres, feeling the history of places, or picking up on unspoken family dynamics. This isn't pathological sensitivity. It's an evolved capacity for field perception that becomes refined through practice. The more you learn to inhabit your body with curious presence rather than analytical interpretation, the more accurately you can read the subtle information constantly flowing through your system. Recent research in embodied cognition reveals that emotional memories are stored not just in the brain, but throughout the connective tissue, muscle fibers, and nervous system. Your body holds impressions of every significant experience, not just your own, but patterns inherited through epigenetic transmission. The chronic tension in your shoulders might contain your father's unexpressed grief. The knot in your stomach could be holding ancestral fear from generations back. These aren't psychological projections. They're somatic realities that can be accessed and transformed through conscious embodiment. For months, she dreamed of water rising through the floors of childhood homes. Always the same progression. First the basement, then the kitchen, finally the bedrooms. She tried dream interpretation books, talked to therapists, looked for literal meanings. It wasn't until she sat with the image somatically, actually feeling the sensation of water rising in her body, that she understood. The dreams weren't about her house. They were about emotional material from her lineage that was ready to surface and be integrated. The Akashic Field communicates through symbol rather than literal information because symbols bypass the ego's tendency to control and interpret. An image of a burning tree might contain more healing wisdom than 1,000 words of analysis. A sudden sense of knowing that arises while washing dishes might carry more truth than years of seeking. The deepest layers of consciousness, what Jung called the archetypal dimension, operate through symbolic logic rather than linear thought. Symbols are holographic. They contain multiple layers of meaning that reveal themselves gradually as your capacity to receive expands. When you dream of being chased, the symbol contains not just personal material about what you're avoiding, but archetypal information about the universal pattern of shadow integration. When you have a vision of an ancestor, the image carries both personal healing information and collective wisdom about how trauma moves through family systems. Learning to read the symbolic language of the field requires a different kind of attention than analytical thinking. It's more like learning to appreciate poetry. You have to feel your way into the meaning rather than dissecting it intellectually. The woman who keeps seeing images of keys in her meditation isn't receiving a literal instruction to look for keys. She's being offered a symbol that contains information about unlocking something in her psyche. The man who has recurring sensations of falling might be receiving field information about his relationship to trust and surrender. True intuition, as distinct from wishful thinking or fear-based projection, arises from a state of relaxed, embodied presence. When your nervous system is regulated and your awareness is grounded in bodily sensation, you become capable of receiving subtle information without contaminating it with personal agenda. The practice involves learning to distinguish between the sharp clarity of authentic intuitive knowing and the muddy complexity of emotional projection. Authentic field information usually arrives with a quality of neutrality and often contains surprising elements that your ego mind wouldn't have generated. His grandfather never spoke about the war, but somehow the weight of those unspoken experiences lived in the family atmosphere. It showed up as an inexplicable anxiety that would arise during happy moments, as if joy itself were dangerous. It wasn't until he began working with family constellation therapy that he realized he was carrying the emotional residue of trauma that predated his birth. Trauma creates energetic fragments, pieces of experience that become separated from conscious awareness but continue to influence your nervous system, your relationships, your capacity for presence. These fragments exist not just in your personal field, but in the larger field of your family system, your cultural lineage, even the collective unconscious. Research in epigenetics reveals that traumatic experiences can create genetic modifications that are passed to subsequent generations. But the transmission isn't just biological, it's also energetic. The unprocessed emotional material of your ancestors continues to move through the field until someone in the lineage develops the capacity to feel it consciously and facilitate its integration. This doesn't mean you're responsible for healing everyone else's trauma. It means that your own healing work often involves recognizing and transforming patterns that originated before your birth. As you develop the capacity to feel and integrate these inherited fragments, you're not just healing yourself, you're serving the larger field of your lineage. The body holds not just personal trauma, but patterns inherited through the field of family consciousness. The way you hold your breath might mirror your mother's relationship to safety. Your difficulty with intimacy could be connected to ancestral patterns of survival and protection. Working with inherited trauma requires a different approach than processing personal experience. It involves developing the capacity to feel into patterns that aren't originally yours, while maintaining clear boundaries about what belongs to you and what you're temporarily holding for the field. From an archetypal perspective, trauma represents interrupted initiation. Something happened that was too much for the nervous system to integrate at the time, so it became frozen in an incomplete state. The traumatic material isn't pathology. It's sacred information that's been waiting for sufficient safety and resources to be received and transformed. When you approach trauma from this perspective, the work becomes less about fixing what's wrong and more about creating conditions for completion. The fragment wants to be welcomed back into conscious awareness, but it needs to feel safe enough to emerge from its protective isolation. She had achieved everything she thought she wanted, but found herself unable to tolerate even 5 minutes of unstructured time. Every moment had to be filled with productivity, entertainment, or social engagement. When her therapist suggested meditation, her first response was to research the most efficient techniques. It took months before she realized her busyness wasn't ambition. It was a sophisticated strategy for avoiding contact with the profound loneliness she had been carrying since childhood. The compulsive need to stay mentally busy often masks a deeper fear of what might emerge in stillness. Your thinking mind, for all its sophistication, can become a barrier to accessing the deeper layers of consciousness where the Akashic Field operates. Modern culture has created an epidemic of cognitive overactivity that serves as a form of spiritual bypassing. We stay busy thinking about spirituality, analyzing our patterns, planning our growth, discussing our insights, all while avoiding the simple presence that would allow deeper transformation to occur. The Akashic Field doesn't respond to mental effort. It reveals itself through states of receptive awareness that can only emerge when the habitual commentary of the thinking mind begins to settle. This isn't about stopping thoughts, but about recognizing when thinking has become a strategy for avoiding feeling. The more desperately you seek spiritual experiences or insights, the more you create internal conditions that make genuine receptivity impossible. The field responds to a quality of relaxed curiosity rather than urgent grasping. True revelation often comes not when you're trying to access higher consciousness, but when you're simply present with what is. Learning to be spiritually lazy, to allow yourself periods of unproductive presence, creates space for the field to communicate. This might involve sitting with your coffee in the morning without checking your phone, taking walks without podcasts or music, or simply lying on the ground and feeling your connection to the earth. These aren't techniques for accessing the Akashic Field. They're ways of creating internal spaciousness, where field information can naturally emerge. The practice is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing what you're supposed to be doing with your awareness. It was then that she realized the silence wasn't empty, but home. She had learned to trust her gut instincts, but gradually realized that many of her intuitive responses were actually trauma-based reactions. The sinking feeling when meeting new people wasn't psychic perception. It was her nervous system's habitual preparation for rejection. Learning to distinguish between authentic, intuitive information and conditioned responses required developing a much more refined awareness of her internal states. Not every gut feeling originates from the deeper wisdom of the field. Many of the sensations we interpret as intuitive guidance are actually echoes of past conditioning, unresolved trauma, or projection of unconscious fears. Developing reliable access to field information requires learning to distinguish between different sources of internal knowing. Authentic intuition operates through the vagus nerve and emerges from a state of nervous system regulation. When your system is in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, the information you receive is filtered through survival programming rather than clear perception. True intuitive knowing usually arrives with a quality of calm certainty, even when the information itself is challenging. Fear-based responses tend to create urgency, confusion, or the need for immediate action to avoid imagined catastrophe. Learning to trust your inner knowing requires developing the capacity to feel the difference between expansion and contraction in your body. Authentic guidance typically creates a sense of opening, even when it's directing you toward difficulty. False guidance usually creates tension, constriction, or a sense of forcing. This discrimination develops through practice with small decisions. When choosing what to eat, which route to take home, or whether to make a phone call, notice the subtle somatic responses to different options. Over time, you'll develop a refined sensitivity to the different qualities of internal information. The silence, and not as absence, but as remembrance. Traumatic experiences create internal voices that masquerade as wisdom, but actually represent attempts to avoid re-experiencing pain. The voice that says don't trust anyone might feel like protective intuition, but it's actually the voice of unintegrated wounding. The authentic voice of field wisdom has a different quality. It tends to be quieter, less emotionally charged, and often contains elements of paradox or surprise that your ego mind wouldn't have generated. It emerges from stillness rather than reactivity and offers guidance that serves your deepest well-being rather than your surface preferences. After years of chronic lower back pain with no clear physical cause, he began working with a somatic therapist who invited him to dialogue with the pain itself. What emerged was the recognition that his back was holding the weight of his father's unexpressed shame about financial failure. Once he was able to feel and release this inherited burden, the chronic pain began to resolve. The body stores emotional experiences as holographic imprints, complete energetic formations that contain not just the feeling, but the entire context of memory, meaning, and somatic response. These emotional holograms exist in your tissues, your nervous system, and the subtle energy field that surrounds your physical form. Recent research suggests that memory isn't stored only in the brain, but throughout the body's cellular matrix. Heart transplant recipients sometimes report preferences and memories that belong to their donors. Children born through IVF occasionally demonstrate traits and responses that seem to connect them to their genetic parents, despite having no conscious exposure to that lineage. This points to a form of information storage that operates through field effects, rather than just biochemical processes. The Akashic Field may be the larger context in which these cellular memories exist and interact. Many chronic physical symptoms that don't respond to medical treatment may be somatic expressions of emotional information that needs to be consciously received. The migraine that appears during family gatherings might be your system's way of processing inherited patterns of communication. The digestive issues that flare during certain relationships could be your body's attempt to metabolize emotional toxicity. This doesn't mean all illness is psychological, but that the body often holds emotional information that seeks integration through physical symptoms. Learning to dialogue with your symptoms, to ask what they need or what they're trying to communicate, can open pathways for healing that purely medical approaches might miss. When you approach your body's sensations with curiosity rather than resistance, you create conditions for the emotional holograms to release their information. This might involve placing your hands on areas of tension and simply listening, breathing into contracted regions, or imagining you're having a conversation with the part of your body that's in distress. Often, the information that emerges isn't literal. A knot in your shoulder might say something like, "I'm tired of carrying everyone else's emotions." A pain in your chest might communicate, "I need permission to grieve." This isn't your imagination. It's your intuitive capacity accessing information stored in somatic memory. The silence, like an ancient voice waiting for someone to listen. Every day at 4 a.m., she would wake without an alarm and feel compelled to sit in silence. Not to meditate with any particular technique, but to simply be present in the pre-dawn darkness. Over months, this became a portal through which she began to access memories, insights, and guidance that were unavailable during the busy hours of her day. She had stumbled into what mystics call kairos, sacred time that operates outside the linear flow of ordinary consciousness. The Akashic Field doesn't operate according to linear time. It exists in what the Greeks called kairos, the eternal now where past, present, and future converge. Accessing field information requires shifting from chronos, sequential time, into kairos, archetypal time, where healing, revelation, and transformation can occur instantaneously. Ritual creates a bridge between ordinary consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche where field information becomes accessible. This doesn't require elaborate ceremonies. Simply lighting a candle, taking 3 conscious breaths, or touching the earth can signal to your nervous system that you're entering sacred time. The power of ritual lies not in the specific actions, but in the quality of presence and intention you bring to the moment. When you approach any activity with ceremonial awareness, drinking water, walking, sitting in silence, you create openings for field communication. One of the greatest obstacles to accessing the Akashic Field is the modern expectation of immediate results. The field operates on its own timeline, which may not align with your desire for quick answers or dramatic experiences. Sometimes information emerges years after you first inquire. Sometimes healing happens in ways you don't immediately recognize. Learning to work with the field requires developing what could be called spiritual patience, the capacity to plant seeds of inquiry and trust that they will bloom when conditions are right, even if that timing doesn't match your personal agenda. Your capacity to access field information varies according to natural cycles, not just the seasons of the year, but the seasons of your nervous system, your emotional landscape, and your spiritual development. There are times when you're naturally more receptive to subtle information, and times when your system needs to focus on integration rather than new input. Learning to recognize and honor these natural rhythms increases your ability to work skillfully with field consciousness. Sometimes the most profound field work involves simply resting and allowing previous insights to integrate rather than seeking new experiences. And in that recognition, the enigma began to dissolve, revealing not answers, but deeper questions that felt like homecoming. Working with dying patients, she noticed that her most effective interventions weren't her words, but her quality of presence. When she could drop into deep listening, not trying to comfort or console, but simply receiving whatever wanted to be expressed, healing would occur in ways that had nothing to do with her actions. She realized that embodied listening had become a form of prayer that served the field of consciousness itself. True listening is a spiritual practice that creates space for the Akashic Field to move through human relationship. When you listen to another person, or to your own inner experience with complete presence and no agenda, you're offering a form of service to the larger field of consciousness. The quality of attention you bring to any moment determines what's available to be received. When you listen with your whole body, rather than just your thinking mind, you become capable of receiving information that exists beneath the surface of words or obvious emotions. This kind of listening involves relaxing the part of you that wants to understand, interpret, or respond, and instead offering your presence as a spacious container for whatever wants to emerge. Often, the most profound healing happens not through what you say or do, but through the quality of witness you provide. When you enter into authentic listening, you create what biologist Rupert Sheldrake calls a morphic field, an energetic pattern that influences everyone within its range. Your commitment to presence creates conditions that allow others to access deeper layers of their own experience. This is why some people leave conversations with you feeling mysteriously lighter or clearer, even when you haven't offered advice or solutions. Your embodied listening has created a field effect that supports their nervous system's natural capacity for self-regulation and insight. You can practice embodied listening not just with other people, but with the field itself. This involves sitting in receptive awareness and asking questions without expecting verbal answers. Instead, you listen with your body for shifts in energy, changes in breathing, images that arise, or subtle knowings that emerge. The practice is learning to recognize the difference between your mind generating answers and authentic information arising from the field. Field responses usually have a quality of surprise and carry emotional resonance that purely mental responses lack. The silence, like a letter that was never opened, waiting to reveal what the soul already knows. She began each day by sitting with her hands on her heart and asking one simple question: what wants to be created today? Then she would listen, not with her mind, but with her entire body, until she felt a clear response. Sometimes it came as an image, sometimes as a sensation, sometimes as an impulse to work with particular colors or materials. Over time, this practice transformed not just her art, but her relationship to guidance itself. Accessing the Akashic Field requires developing practical skills for embodied receptivity. These aren't complex meditation techniques, but simple ways of creating internal spaciousness where field information can naturally emerge. Conscious breathing creates a bridge between your personal awareness and the larger field of consciousness. Not forced breathing exercises, but the simple practice of feeling your breath as it moves through your body, noticing how it changes in different emotional states, and using breath awareness to regulate your nervous system. When your breathing is relaxed and natural, your system becomes more receptive to subtle information. When it's constricted or controlled, you're more likely to project your own material rather than receiving clear field guidance. Water has unique properties for enhancing field sensitivity. Taking conscious baths, sitting by natural bodies of water, or simply drinking water with full presence can increase your capacity to receive subtle information. Many indigenous traditions recognize water as a carrier of memory and consciousness. The practice involves using water encounters as opportunities to reset your nervous system and open to field communication. This might mean taking a shower with the intention of washing away mental clutter, or sitting by a stream and allowing its sound to attune your internal rhythms. Direct contact with the earth, lying on grass, sitting against trees, or simply taking off your shoes and feeling the ground, helps regulate your nervous system and increases field sensitivity. The Earth's electromagnetic field has measurable effects on human physiology and consciousness. Grounding practices aren't just about feeling more centered. They're about establishing energetic connection with the larger field of which you're a part. When you're truly grounded, you become capable of receiving information that flows through the planetary consciousness itself. Perhaps the most important practice for field access is learning to be present without agenda. This means creating time in your life for what could be called sacred idleness, periods when you're not trying to accomplish anything, understand anything, or become anything different than you already are. In these spaces of non-doing, the field often reveals information that's been waiting for your system to become quiet enough to receive it. The practice is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing what you're supposed to be doing with your awareness and trusting that presence itself is sufficient. Ritual. Invitation. Tomorrow morning, before your day begins, place one hand on your heart and one on your belly. Ask silently, "What does my soul need today?" Then listen, not with your mind, but with your whole being, until something shifts inside you. It might be a word, an image, a sensation, or simply a sense of knowing. Trust whatever emerges, even if it surprises you. After years of seeking teachers, techniques, and transcendent experiences, she finally understood that what she had been searching for was already present in the quality of attention she brought to each moment. The Akashic Field wasn't somewhere else. It was the invisible dimension of the present moment that revealed itself when she stopped trying to get somewhere else and began to truly inhabit where she already was. The deepest revelation about working with the Akashic Field is that it's not separate from your ordinary human experience. It's the subtle dimension of consciousness that becomes accessible when you develop the capacity to be fully present with whatever is arising in your awareness without trying to change, fix, or transcend it. True spiritual development doesn't take you away from your human experience. It deepens your capacity to be present with the full spectrum of what it means to be embodied consciousness. The field doesn't offer escape from your wounds, your challenges, or your ordinary responsibilities. It offers the possibility of engaging with all of these from a place of expanded awareness and connected presence. The woman who learns to dialogue with her chronic pain discovers information about inherited patterns that need integration. The man who stops running from his anxiety finds that it contains guidance about authenticity and boundaries. The parent who practices embodied presence with their children creates field effects that support the entire family system's capacity for emotional regulation and spiritual connection. What you've been calling emptiness or boredom may actually be your system's attempt to create space for field communication. The discomfort you feel in unstructured time might be withdrawal from the addiction to mental stimulation that prevents deeper forms of knowing from emerging. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's a different form of language that operates through presence, sensation, and subtle knowing, rather than words and concepts. Learning to be comfortable in silence is learning to receive information through channels that your thinking mind cannot control or interpret. The Akashic Field isn't a database you access for personal benefit. It's a living dimension of consciousness that responds to the quality of relationship you bring to it. When you approach the field with curiosity, respect, and willingness to serve something larger than your personal agenda, it becomes a source of guidance, healing, and connection that transforms every aspect of your life. This relationship develops slowly, through consistent practice of embodied presence rather than dramatic spiritual experiences. The field reveals itself through the accumulation of small moments of authentic listening, through your increasing capacity to feel without immediately reacting, and through your willingness to trust information that doesn't always match your surface preferences. Here, in this space of recognition, the soul remembers what the mind had forgotten, that it was never truly lost, only learning to listen in a different language. What you call silence is simply the soul speaking without translation. Let the void speak. It knows more of you than your whole story. In the space between your thoughts, ancient memories are stirring. In the pause between your heartbeats, the field is offering information that could change everything about how you understand your life. In the silence you've learned to fill with noise, your deepest wisdom is waiting to be remembered. The next time you find yourself in a quiet moment, waiting in line, sitting in your car, lying in bed before sleep, instead of reaching for distraction, allow yourself to simply be present with the silence. Feel your breath. Notice the sensations in your body. Listen not for words, but for the subtle information that's always moving through the field of your awareness. You don't need special abilities or years of training to access the Akashic Field. You need only the willingness to be present with what is already here, to listen with your whole being rather than just your thinking mind, and to trust that consciousness itself is intelligent and responsive to the quality of attention you offer. The field has been speaking to you your entire life. It's time to learn its language. What once felt empty was a silent temple waiting to be inhabited. When you listen to silence, the field responds with remembrance. In the comments below, share what the silence has already whispered to you. Perhaps there, between words, something from the field will reveal itself to others walking this same path of remembrance. And if you're ready to explore more about working with the invisible dimensions of consciousness, subscribe, not for more content, but for communion with others who recognize that the deepest truths are often found in the spaces between thoughts.